At SFU, under the supervision of Dr. Mark Jackert, who is a leading energy economy modeler in North America. And my co-supervisor is John Axon, who helped me to prepare the slides. And the way I look at carbon taxation is a little bit different from how most traditional economists would look at carbon taxation. I don't only look at economic costs and environmental effectiveness of climate policies, I also look at human perceptions. I study public support for different types of climate policies because the climate policy choice is a question of value. Public support influences political decisions and determines the chances of climate policy implementation into the future. So the key messages that I'm going to deliver today are: British Columbia's carbon tax is good. It's a very unique policy. British Columbia is one of the few jurisdictions in the world with such a successful, effective policy. It needs to be stronger if we want to achieve our targets, greenhouse gas emission targets, relying primarily on this policy. But as my research results will show, the political future of the carbon tax is highly uncertain. And as a result, my conclusion is a carbon tax alone is not enough. We need a portfolio of different effective compulsory policies that would allow us to achieve our long-term targets. So first message is British Columbia's carbon tax is good. So I'll skip this slide because you heard that several times. It's just an overview of the carbon tax in British Columbia. So there are many benefits to carbon taxation. First, it is fair. Carbon taxes are paid only by those people who pollute emissions. So if you decide to go to work by bus, or if you decide to ride a bike to work, you don't pay the carbon tax. If you drive to work, you pay the carbon tax. Carbon tax is favored by most economists because it's efficient. And it's been mentioned before that it puts the price on for every unit of emissions on all individuals and businesses. Therefore, it allows to reduce the total cost to society. And so people have a choice to either pay the tax or to switch to lower carbon technologies or to change their behaviors. And when deciding about lower carbon technologies, people can choose any technologies that they think are the cheapest to them. So in this regard, carbon tax allows freedom. Consumers and industry are not forced to adopt any specific technologies. They can decide themselves how to react to the tax. And finally, the carbon tax sends a very direct price signal, so it stimulates innovation. And over time, once manufacturers gain experience, the costs of new technologies go down and newer low carbon technologies are adopted. And those technologies could include any types of renewable energy forms or energy efficiency devices and so on. But there is a huge issue with carbon taxes. Historically, carbon taxes have been very difficult in terms of political acceptability. It's quite hard to implement taxes due to the high cost visibility that Stuart mentioned. It's good for emission reductions, but because carbon taxes send such a direct price signal that is reflected in gas prices, and media likes to reinforce the message about increased gas prices, carbon tax becomes very difficult politically. Also, there is a biased perception among many people in the public against any policies that appear to increase taxes, even if they are designed to be revenue neutral. So there are many human perception issues that make this policy not that easy to implement and to sustain in the future. And I'm going to talk about this in detail in a minute. So first, I want to explain the difference between technology-specific policies, which are regulations, and technology-neutral policies, such as carbon taxes. So say we put a policy in place that forces you to buy an electric vehicle. That will be a very technology-specific policy. It could be very expensive for you to buy an electric vehicle because you don't have any other choices. That's what you have to buy. You cannot buy anything else. But you can make this policy less specific. You can say, well, you can buy any vehicle that has zero emissions. So it can be either an electric car or a hydrogen car. Or you can make a policy technology neutral, like carbon tax. You can either buy a new car, electric car, hydrogen car, or you can decide to take transit, you can move and live closer to work. So you have a bunch of choices, and it's up to you to decide what the cheapest way you want to choose. So that's why carbon tax gives you freedom. It's more efficient than regulations. That's why it's favored by most economists. And so I mentioned that over time, as we produce more units of a new technology, manufacturers gain more experience, so purchase price of that technology will decline. I think about LED light bulbs. 10 years ago, they were much more expensive than now. Another process here shows that over time, once we produce more units of a new technology, market share of that technology increases, and consumers perceive less barriers towards new technology. And barriers include not only cost barriers, but all sorts of behavioral and risk perception barriers, including attractiveness of a new technology, status fit of a new technology, failure rates associated with newer technology, and so on. Over time, these issues disappear as manufacturers gain experience and market share of new technologies increases. And so, can we make a really effective carbon tax? Yes, we can. And we could increase the tax rate to a substantial level, and independent research shows that to achieve greenhouse gas emission targets here in British Columbia, primarily by using British Columbia's carbon tax, the rate of the tax should be set at almost $200 per ton. We can design the tax in such a way that people know long-term schedule of rate increases so that they have certainty about their future costs, and it allows people and businesses time and gives people and businesses time to prepare for any new investments or to change their behaviors over time. And we can also make taxes revenue neutral, like British Columbia's carbon tax. So this is all good, and this seems very straightforward, but I will go back again to the issue of political acceptability. The question is, why is British Columbia the only one jurisdiction in North America with such a serious carbon tax? Why, since 2008, no other jurisdictions in North America and many other countries have not implemented similar carbon taxes? And the answer is, the political future of the carbon tax is highly uncertain. It's very difficult to promote carbon taxes. So as part of my PhD thesis, I conducted a survey on consumer perceptions of British Columbia's climate policies. And specifically, I had a representative sample of British Columbia's voters, and they were represented by income, education, age, and gender, according to the census data. And that was a web-based survey that took about 27 minutes to complete. And this data is very fresh. So I collected data in January this year. So a couple of questions from that survey that I asked were included. First, can you name any policies that you think currently exist in British Columbia? So a very open-ended question. Participants had a chance to choose, I don't know, any policies implemented in British Columbia, or they could name up to 5 policies that they thought are currently implemented in British Columbia. After that, I gave participants a list of existing and non-existing policies in British Columbia, and I asked them to pick any policies that they think, again, currently exist in British Columbia. So a close-ended question. And finally, I asked them about their level of support or opposition to different types of climate policies that we have in British Columbia. And that's how we define the carbon tax, basically a tax on greenhouse gas emissions, such as carbon pollution from burning gasoline. And so this first graph here shows the number of policies that people identified before and after receiving that list of policies. So in Blue is basically the real knowledge about climate policies in British Columbia. 73% of people, 73% of British Columbia's voters could not identify any climate policies at all. 26% of British Columbians could identify one or maybe two climate policies. And once the list of policies was provided, most got at least one correct policy. So that's an interesting finding. Another way to look at this question is to see what kind of policies people identified. So again, in blue, those policies that they identified themselves without any prompt, and in red, those policies that they identified from the list that we gave them. So as you can see, in both cases, the carbon tax was the most frequently named climate policy before and after providing information. So what it means is that carbon tax, again, is very visible. People are aware of it. It sends a direct price signal. And so it's very important to keep this in mind when people analyze questions of support and opposition to carbon taxes, which I'm going to do right now. So this graph here shows the most recent levels of support and opposition to different climate policies that we have in British Columbia, including carbon neutral government, clean electricity regulation, clean fuel regulation, carbon tax, and energy efficiency regulations for buildings. There is support for carbon tax. 56% of people do support British Columbia's carbon tax. But there is also very high, very strong opposition to the carbon tax among all other policies tested in this survey. So, and keep in mind that there was almost zero knowledge associated with any other policies, and carbon tax was the most known policy among all the policies tested. So, knowing how high the public resistance, how high the level of public resistance is to the carbon tax, knowing that BC is one of the few jurisdictions in the world with such a serious policy, and knowing that Chrissy Clark promised to freeze the carbon tax for another 5 years, the question that I want to raise is, should the goal of the climate policy making be public support for a policy or absence of public opposition, public resistance to policy? What should we focus on to make sure that climate policies endure for long periods of time so that they could be implemented and we can achieve our emission reductions that we need to achieve? And so, as a result of this, my conclusion, carbon tax alone is not enough. We need to look at other sets of policies that could complement the carbon tax. So here, I want to say that we need compulsory climate policies. This graph here shows what type of policies exist out there, compulsory and non-compulsory ones, and only these ones, standards and emission pricing, can allow us to achieve our targets because they impose a real cost on emissions. Non-compulsory policies alone cannot help us achieve those targets. So again, some examples of what we can do. We can do regulations. We can implement zero-emission vehicle standards like California has, which basically requires vehicle manufacturers to have to produce certain number of zero-emission vehicles per year, depending on their annual vehicle sales. Zero-emission electricity policies, such as the one we have in British Columbia, the clean electricity standard that requires at least 93% of new electricity to be generated from clean sources. It could be a low-carbon fuel standard that requires lower carbon intensity in transportation fuels. It could be zero-emission building regulations, such as energy efficiency regulations that could be embedded in the building code. We could do emissions pricing, we could do cap and trade, we could do carbon taxes if they are politically acceptable and don't cause too much resistance. We could invest in new recharge and refueling infrastructure. We can expand public transit. So there are many, many options out there. And the main worry about regulations is that they're most they are more expensive than carbon taxes. And it is true because they don't impose the same price on all sectors in the economy. For some people, it's cheaper to buy an electric car. For some people, it's more expensive. So, but we can design all of these policies in a market-friendly way, like zero-emission vehicle standards in California that allows credit trading among the regulated agents. And the clean electricity policy in British Columbia doesn't force any specific energy forms except for zero-emission energy forms. So companies, independent power producers that we have in British Columbia can choose among solar, wind, hydro, coal plants with carbon capture and storage. So they have many different options that they can choose among and decide which option is the cheapest. So in the final note I want to say is that knowing how urgent the climate change issue is, I think we should really focus our efforts on implementing many different effective compulsory policies that lack public resistance and that can endure, therefore, for a long period of time. Thank you.
Well, we're now going to open the floor to questions, and I would welcome questions from either side, and so please do use the microphone as we are recording this session. And please address your questions to any one of the panelists or to all of them if you so prefer. Ma'am?
And that's really my question, but I've got, I was wondering if you calculate the full life cycle analysis. I mean, what if raising corporate taxes, which are disproportionately low in comparison to personal taxes, and put it into alternative energy, public transportation, and into positive things like that, along with regulations. And I don't think we should say we shouldn't do regulations because they're too costly. Regulations prevent pollution, and this is one of the problems that's happening internationally, that because this market-based economy and addressing the issues of climate change has really affected the whole discussion internationally. Because rather than coming up with firm commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they're relying on market-based solutions, which certainly the developing countries oppose. So, just one.
Thank you for your question, Madam Stewart.
Well, that's an easy one. Let me just say at the beginning that I spent the first 15 years of my career probably feeling much the same way you just did. My first lawsuit was suing Exxon over the Valdez oil spill. I've taken on clear-cut logging in most of BC, won 4 cases in the Supreme Court of Canada against polluters and government. So but I realized at the end of all that, and this, I'm not saying I'm right, but this is why I do this stuff, is that I was, I guess, litigating against corporate leaders with the sense that they were the bad guys. And I got to meet some of them, and I realized that none of them actually woke up in the morning thinking, gee, I'd like to screw up the planet today. Well, maybe some of them did. I didn't meet those people. They all woke up just thinking, I've got a responsibility to shareholders, I've got employees, I have to make a profit. And if they could do that in a way that didn't involve messing up the environment, they would have been really happy to do it. Now, so what was stopping them was they were getting the wrong price signals. The things they were doing that was really hurting the environment, they weren't having to pay those true costs. If they had to pay those real costs, they could actually then make money by lowering their environmental footprint. And they, most of the ones I've talked to, and they still would like to do that, would have liked that. They would have felt better about themselves as human beings. So I'm not saying I'm right, but I can tell you in my career, I made a shift from thinking that I would just fight the bad guys head on in court and litigate against them, to thinking that I would actually try to get the market to tell the environmental truth in a way that would actually align their own moral and economic motivations. We'll see if that proves out to be right or a waste of time, but I can tell you numbers like this really make me feel awfully good about that choice. So you say that regulations are the answer. I'm not aware of any greenhouse gas regulation in the world that's produced the kind of results BC's carbon tax has produced. Nothing. I mean, I'm not aware of any other jurisdiction that's driven down fuel use by 16% in 4 years with any regulation. So the problem is we get this sense that putting a price on pollution simply lets people pay their way out of bad behavior. But it doesn't in a way, because they still end up reducing the numbers tell the story, right? They actually have reduced emissions because what's leading them to pollute in the first place is the sense it doesn't cost them anything. Once it costs them anything, they're not stupid. they're going to go out and reduce their emissions. In fact, companies are some of the most rational calculating. They're more likely to do it than individuals because they're looking at every dollar savings they can. Their accountants are poring over this stuff and saying, aha, I can tell you, I deal with these guys, and they say, when I'm making long-term investments in new technology, I'm looking at, whether they'll pay themselves off. If I'm going to bring in, a carbon capture plant that's going to strip carbon emissions out of my fuel supply, am I actually going to be able to pay that off? And the problem in BC, and I'll give you a good example tangibly. Alberta, the main company that had the largest investment in coal, carbon, and capture and storage. So essentially that's coal emissions and stores it underground. It's not perfect, but generally works pretty well. They abandoned that project last year. They abandoned it because they said there's not a high enough carbon price to make it worthwhile. If there was a carbon price, this investment makes a ton of sense for us, but we need to have a carbon price of $30 a ton or higher in order to do this, and we had anticipated having that price. Shell did the same with Iogen, which is a new technology that looks at how you basically produce oil or gasoline from cellulose. They abandoned their investment in that last year because they said without a carbon price, doing this type of clean alternative fuel doesn't make sense. So I'm with you in spirit. But let me just say, I won't get into it. Offsets can be done wrongly and they can be done correctly. I'll agree with you on that. I can give you lots of examples of really good offsets and I can give you lots of examples of bad offsets. So, it's an emerging technology, but I'm talking only about carbon taxes in this talk or environmental taxes.
We know that carbon, I think most of us here are supporters of carbon taxes, but we need to have them globally. Can you tell me what work's being done at the UN or into other international forums to get other jurisdictions to have better carbon taxes?
That might be a question to...
Yeah. Well, I guess the short answer would be not enough. Largely, the story of carbon taxes has been jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and I think there was some good pieces in the PowerPoints on the European experience. There is groups that are promoting it, again, largely in Europe. But to be candid, our experience has really been kind of leader-to-leader conversations. So I would say pretty much every major Asian state has been to BC to talk about the carbon tax. We've had conversations with many think tanks out of the US, several local states, but we do lack a strong, clear, international, professional entity, kind of like a Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, but at a global level. That doesn't quite exist. And most of the international negotiations, of course, are still focused on getting countries to agree to binding commitments and how that'll happen. So, we don't want to overstate the pace of momentum in terms of broader adoption. What we have that's different today than in the past is jurisdictions like BC that have a real track record now. This has moved out of economic theory into something that you can at least test, whether you like it or not.
And just to add, I agree with everything you just said, but there is actually a bit more momentum. I don't want you to feel totally discouraged. So Italy's just brought in a carbon tax. Ireland's brought in a carbon tax. Obviously, Australia's brought in one. South Africa announced they'll have one starting next year. China's announced they'll have one starting next year. So there is, I wouldn't say that it's become the norm, but there's a fair amount of, we were in a bit of a bubble in North America in thinking that this is outside the realm of the politically possible. And in most other parts of the world, if you look at the range of carbon policy instruments, I would say carbon tax is probably as common or more common than other choices that are being made. I've just given you some lists of pretty significant. England just brought in a form of carbon tax, which is a price floor below the ETS. So there is some movement on it, nowhere near enough, and certainly we need to see it globally. I agree totally.
I just would like to comment. Yes, there are carbon taxes in European countries, but the way they're implemented and they were implemented in especially Scandinavian countries was different from the way BC carbon tax was implemented here. Those taxes were, to some extent, replaced existing energy taxes existing in those countries, or many exemptions were introduced to ensure that the new carbon taxes would not cause a lot of public opposition. So we have to look carefully at the way how carbon taxes are introduced in different countries. And I think Stuart also mentioned that he hasn't seen any regulations that had the same impact as the BC carbon tax had. And I, with my supervisor, Dr. Jacker, conducted an analysis on the clean electricity standard that we have in British Columbia, and obviously the standard allowed to reduce dramatic amount of emissions right away when it was implemented in 2007 by halting 2 coal plants and 1 natural gas plant on Vancouver Island, because it basically said that no more electricity can be produced from those dirty sources. So there are examples of those.
Did that lead to a 16% decline in emissions? I can assure you those wouldn't have increased emissions by 16%.
Well, we can calculate that.
I can tell you it wouldn't have been close to 16%.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I found it very intriguing. I was just wondering, and James and Katya, I think you alluded to some of your personal thoughts or the thoughts that have come out of your research on if the province should be using carbon tax revenue to combat climate change. And I was kind of wondering if you could elaborate more on all of your positions on that. I'm coming from it partially from a background of advocacy in the student movement, where here in BC we've had a lot of funding cuts to post-secondary education, at the same time as the government has placed the requirement upon post-secondary institutions to become carbon neutral. So we've had our funding decreased and had been given no means to meet those targets. I think they're very necessary targets to meet, and we should be meeting them, but I believe that we should be given the means to, and I think that a carbon tax is a good source of those. So I'm interested in your thoughts.
Well, I think first off, the quote I'd used was the way that the budget reflected the principle of revenue neutrality, and you know, it's easy for me to support that because I happen to personally believe it as well. But I think you know, it's important to recognize that the carbon tax exists within a bunch of other stuff. So if you're interested in budgets and taxes and spending, there's a lot of taxes and there's a lot of spending. And in a simple way, there's a school of thought that government should think of the best way to collect revenue and then the best way to spend money. No government is entirely pure on that. We have lots of examples, but that's a public policy question. In this instance, what we've seen is you know, there are winners and losers by changing any cost on the economy. And so a carbon cost is going to do that. Using tax measures is a way to mitigate those impacts. And so in this case, on a test of competitiveness, the view of the government of BC was a broad-based tax reform. Tax recycling was the best way to do it. But note that we've spent a lot of money on positive investments in climate action in BC. It's a $14 billion commitment by several governments around public transportation, spending on an innovative clean energy fund, spending on home energy retrofit programs. So it's not to say that the government wasn't committed, that there's good spending, and in fact has set those within the priorities that all governments face. It just said for the purposes of changing the tax burden, we think revenue neutrality is there. It is definitely the interesting part of the global debate right now, both in economics and in public support. And you'll see the people pushing for carbon taxes in the state of Washington, state of Oregon, are all looking at what they would call an adjusted BC model, which is a hybrid of the two. And for social scientists, it's kind of an interesting thing to watch. So there's no, you know, right or wrong answer on that.
Okay, I've got, I'm going to cheat. I've got 2 questions, but I'll make them very short. One for Stuart. One is how much of the differential in performance between BC and the rest of Canada can be attributed to extra emissions in Alberta from the oil sands specifically? And my second question for James is the BC government contemplating any carbon tax on emissions from the natural gas industry, and specifically fugitive emissions, and most specifically CO2 emissions, which can be well measured from some of the natural gas operations?
Good question. I don't have a precise answer. I do have a chart comparing BC's emissions trajectory with Alberta's over that period. And Alberta's has gone up slightly, but not that much, just because they already had a lot of oil and gas emissions in 2008. So they were already starting at a higher place, and they've tracked more or less flatline. So certainly some of the change, but it would be a small. I would, off the top of my head, I would say probably, I'd be surprised if it was more than 1% of that 16% gap. But remember, the oil sands, most of the emissions you hear talking about are emissions that will happen in the future, right? The oil sands is really just on its development curve right now. So when all of the new investments that are going into the ground today get developed over the next 10 to 15 years, you will see the amount of Canada's emissions profile from the oil sands, that wedge will grow dramatically. It's not that large yet. It's where it's growing to that's the biggest worry.
Yeah, on the changes of the carbon tax, I guess, first off to note, we've been through an election and are actually awaiting a new cabinet, which was announced to come in later this week. But the budget 2013 prior to the election was quite clear that it maintained the carbon tax as is and did not plan for any changes, either to increase it or to broaden it to cover the emissions you're talking about. And again, the main concern there is weighing the impacts of those changes against the context that our neighboring and competing jurisdictions aren't close to those levels yet. So there's a test on that.
Let me just jump in and say, covering fugitives to me seems like a political no-brainer. Right? And if you're making average people pay $30 a ton for the fuel they put in their cars or to heat their homes, and to exempt the oil and gas industry from paying that same price when it's making pretty significant profits just seems politically indefensible to me almost.
If I could just do a supplemental to the supplemental. I think what's important here is to remember that the objective is to reduce emissions, not to push policies. And actually, there was a good point made earlier that you can tax things, but you can also regulate them. You can spend on programs. You can make voluntary measures. The government of BC has been very clear. It's taking action in the upstream. We're pursuing work with the industry around greater use of clean electricity, carbon capture and storage. We've got actual regulations on venting and flaring in BC. And so the government, what it said is, it's not prepared to use the tax mechanism. It's not, it has said that it's going to continue to work with the industry. It has greenhouse gas targets, and it's moving that way. So I think it's a policy choice question as far as we know today, rather than something else.
So coming from the outside of this discussion and having not seen these statistics before, one of the common themes I hear around the carbon tax is how are we going to compete with other industries where they're not taxed on their carbon emissions, especially high carbon emission industries. At least I'm not aware of any tax on imports where there's a high carbon industry where they're not doing anything with their policy. And are we giving any benefits to high carbon emitters when they're trying to export and sell? That's really my question, because I'm not aware of anything at the moment.
Sorry, the question is on the trade competitiveness.
Yeah, just competition in general with carbon taxes. I mean, yeah. We're putting a tax on industries who may or may not have a way of reducing their carbon emissions, and we're asking them to compete globally with countries that may or may not care. So what are we doing to offset that cost?
Well, so the first issue is, one is you can look at a cost to a business, and then you have to see what the effect that drives. So simply increasing cost doesn't always impact competitiveness. And what's interesting in the BC case is that we've got a lot of things. We've got actually very low electricity prices, so that's a competitive advantage. We've got high carbon prices, which could be argued as a disadvantage. And so when we look at these industries, kind of the first point is, what's the holistic look and how is it there? You're right to be concerned about the issue because I think there's two things. One is if you get it wrong, there's an economic harm, but secondly, there's an environmental harm. So we have cement producers in BC. They're a very fossil fuel intensive production, and cement producers in the state of Washington. And the bags of cement are sold in both jurisdictions. There's no environmental benefit to having less cement produced in BC and more in Washington. And so that's, you run into, if you get it wrong, a bad case where, in fact, you're taking an economic hit and you're not getting an environmental benefit. Secondly, with the knock-on effect, no other jurisdiction is going to follow that path. So BC, in my opinion, has taken a very prudent approach. As a side note, we've seen jobs move from cement industries in Washington to BC in the last year. The main measure we're using is having one of the lowest corporate tax rates in the OECD, which helps all businesses. And also, by lowering personal income taxes, we're helping with the cost of labor. And then again, other benefits unrelated to the carbon tax, low electricity rates, secure investment environment. And it's those types of things as a package that we try to make BC a good place to invest. But it's definitely, if you could just, it's actually not that hard to implement a carbon tax, with apologies to the guys who had to do it from tax policy. The hard part is figuring out the right economic outcomes.
And just to build on that, I mean, that's the most important question, I think, in terms of the politics of doing this stuff. If you look at, so I'm part of, I actually chair a working group that has a bunch of CEOs and NGO leaders looking at how we design good climate policy. And the math of it's pretty simple, right? So if you're a company, you basically need to look at what percentage of your cost goes into energy or fuel, right? And so for most companies, that's a pretty small part of their cost, less than 5%, often less than that. And if the carbon tax increases that, let's say it's 2 or 3% by 5%, that's a pretty small number you're left with in the overall noise that costs go up and down. So it's really, as James said, it's this small group of companies that are very energy intensive and export intensive. Cement's one. BC doesn't have many. Ontario has a lot. So it's this is a tougher conversation in Ontario. And Katerina got that a little bit. Some of those Northern European countries that have coal-based power systems, it's a tougher conversation there because it starts to become a bigger slice of the cost pie for some of your companies. So nickel manufacturing, steel, wood, anything that involves processing a mineral is very energy intensive often. Or anything that has high transportation costs, where trucking. So oil sands, a lot of the emissions is this big building-sized trucks running around the big mining holes. It's actually, a lot of their emissions is just the emissions from the trucks digging the stuff up. So at the moment, what industries say is this: for most companies, $30 a ton doesn't get to the point that it causes any meaningful harm. And as James says, the offsetting corporate tax cuts mean that it's not enough of a hit to really worry about it, except for that small slice of companies. And so if BC did continue to increase the carbon tax, or if a place like Ontario brought it in, you would have to look at probably some type of transitional relief for companies that were really affected, or you'd lose them, right? And you could say as a society we're willing to lose them, but a lot of people that work for them may not agree with you on that choice, and it becomes a tough political issue. So that's it's a really, really good question.
Thank you. Sir.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for all the great stats. I hadn't had a chance to see these before now. I have two questions. One is a quick one is a longer one. The first quick one is just, were any of those numbers that you provided indexed to population at all? Because I know as we have a higher population growth in the rest of Canada, that could skew some numbers. And the larger question is asked for a friend of mine who'll be watching the webcast later. I'm wondering what the possibilities are and what your thoughts are on having a percentage of the carbon tax diverted to provide low interest or 0% interest loans for home and business, I guess residential and commercial building efficiency renovations, something like property assessed clean energy financing, where you can have a loan tied to the property and not the owner, and then you can create the quite a large incentive to do like a massive amount of work on updating energy efficiency. So I'm just wondering what opportunities or possibilities or thoughts there are on that. Thanks.
Yeah, the numbers are indexed to population. Yes.
So I guess on the second one, so first off, BC's approach is not to link the carbon tax revenue directly to spending. But secondly, we do spend money on good climate programs, and we've got a lot of examples of those. We have a program right now which provides incentives for the types of activities you're talking about, and we're very interested in policy ideas moving to more what you're talking about, sort of bigger rather than incentives which are high cost with the result, but still high cost, to a different type of financing instrument. And so, I would just say that if your friend is doing some work on that area, we read those research papers, so you can send them in to me because we like to look at them. We have got a work with our Ministry of Energy and Fortis BC and BC Hydro around utility-based financing, so that if a homeowner wants to put in a heat pump, which is a high upfront cost, but they save money, they can finance that against their property. A bit like hot water heaters in Ontario, you rarely own them. They kind of, you lease them. And we could get there in BC. And so we're experimenting. It's early days, and I guess it's a good one to send in the system. Actually, Pics has done some work as well in those fields.
Just another thing I'd say is people have asked all kinds of questions about how we should spend carbon tax revenue. And I've been parts of tons of discussions like this. And where I come down is it's really a question of how government should spend our tax money. And finding any one right answer to that question is, there's no one right answer, right? I mean, this is why we have elections in different political parties, is there are many different ways in which we could spend tax revenues. And really, in a lot of cases, it'll depend on the government, and they're all good uses, depending on whose perspective you look at them from. But the important thing is to put a price on carbon and other forms of pollution as well. And then having a healthy debate in society about what the best use for those revenues is actually democratically a good thing to have. But they shouldn't get in the way of remembering that we should be taking the first step, which actually has the effect of reducing emissions, and not let the debate over how we use those revenues get in the way of doing that good first thing.
We'll take the last question.
Thank you. I'm a student and I drive a taxi. Because of the fuel tax, my income has gone down, my costs has gone up, and my income has stayed the same. Just last night, I emailed a friend to say that Buffy St. Marie is singing at UVic. Would you like to come? She said, since the price of gas has gone up, we don't go out as often. My question to you is, when we expect people in Victoria to drive their bicycle in the rain and get wet like a rat, what is the footprint of 8 years of war in Afghanistan? What is the footprint of the war in Iraq? What's the footprint of sending a tank halfway around the world to wage a war? Why are we penny wise and pound foolish? What's the footprint of 900 military bases around the world? United States, as the modern day Roman Empire, has over 900 military bases around the world. What's the carbon footprint of the Minister of Defense flying once a month to Afghanistan for a photo opportunity?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's a question for James.
Yeah. So first off, just to say in a short answer is that you're right, that there's a lot of activities globally which have huge emission impacts. The military industry is one of them, right? In the BC context, and I don't mean to evade the question, but the problem here is we as a government have zero influence over the way the US runs its military or takes actions to protect its security. What we can do is influence the emissions here in BC. So we've chosen to start with action, and I think it's a legitimate public discourse of whether one person should act first when another person's not acting. The problem is, I would say, that we've known about climate change definitively for at least 30 years, and we're paying the costs of waiting to get the perfect answer to that. So, you can agree or disagree with BC's approach. I'm just here to explain it to the audience. We chose to lead through action. You can, by the way, drive your car and not bike in the rain, right? You just pay a small cost for the pollution that you create, which has been proven to have a harm on all people, right? So it's a small harm and it's a small cost, but I think the important step here was you have to get started. If you have influence on the military, if they implemented a carbon price, there would be huge benefits.
To offset the war.
And I would say that most military strategies are based on fossil fuel supply lines. So I think they'd actually have a triple benefit of energy cost savings, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and improved security by paying attention to your fossil fuels. So I'm not sure what your discipline is, but when I leave this job, it's an academic interest I'd love to pursue. So
I just want to add that as an Ottawa resident, I don't have a lot of sympathy for British Columbians biking in the rain in January. Sorry, but the sympathy card's just not working there. Snowdrifts. But I guess the only thing I would say is, hearkening back to how Tom started the session, there was a leaked report done for the U.S. military a couple of years ago, and these are not environmentalists, these are U.S. military strategists that look into the future and try and look at factors that will cause instability that may require a military response for the U.S. And they listed the threat of climate change near the top of the list of threats to stability around the world. Tom gave some examples of why that's happening. He looked at food cost as a pathway. You could look at geographic instability as areas that were once fertile become more desert. You could look at coastal regions that become, as water rises. You could look at increasing storms that displace large sections. So the costs of allowing climate change to go unchecked, I would wager, I haven't done research on this, are probably as big a threat to our stability of our society as any facing us. I mean, in a lot of ways, for 8,000 years, since the agricultural revolution, human society has flourished because we've lived in this remarkable window of climate stability, where you could invest in building long-term cities and societies in a place, assuming that in 100 years or 1,000 years, there would still be stability for that place to exist. And it's almost, we take that for granted, right? It's like living on the 20th floor of a building and just assuming that the whole foundation that supported the 19 floors below will always be there. But we're messing with that foundation in a way that we don't have any experience in human society of messing with. And I don't think we can really fully appreciate the risks we're dealing with. I mean, I'm not a climate scientist, so I only know what I hear from them. But if your concern is political instability and resulting military action, boy, you ought to be the biggest, most committed climate change activist around.
If I could add just one small point to that. Your point about your fuel costs went up for driving the cab, and thus that's harmed your income. It is important to remember that income tax in British Columbia has gone down as a direct result of the carbon tax. And the lowest two income stratas each went down 5%. And so you may be paying more for fuel, but you're paying less for income tax. And I don't know how those wash out in any particular individual's case, but for most people in British Columbia, we're better shape. Now, if you drive an awful lot, there might be even more shape. And I'm sorry for that, but that's what we'll have to adjust. Well, let me close the session then by just saying a few more words. First of all, I want to thank the Pics staff, some of whom are here today, because organizing these things takes a surprisingly large amount of time. So thanks very much to all of you.